there is actually an organisation of the left of the Labor Party, we know which it's got its own structure. So have you given this material to those key parts of the political progressive, okay? And my second question, which is allied to that, is how do you explain how much Labor Party has drifted into a bipartisan position almost, as far as the far-right policies of the Conservative present Abbott government? How do you? We know it's bipartisan. We know they're not making any effective stand. But what's your understanding of why they've drifted so far from being a straightforward social democratic party?
The questions raised about issues with labour economics are all important. I was politicised through the uranium movement and have always been concerned about the environment. And, you know, I do think there is a problem with consumption and having an economy that's built on never-ending increased consumption. My concern is, I think my position on that is way to the left of about 99% of the Australian population. So I actually think we should be thinking creatively about using working time as a tool for job sharing, and the first major research project I did in my research centre was for ACOS on that very question. But I can't see in the short run, you know, in the next 2 to 3 years, if we really want to stop the misery that the other two speakers talked about, you're going to have to use aggregate demand. There's no other tool in the toolbox to actually solve that kind of misery. So yes, in the medium to long term, I'm all for a radical change in working time, but I think suffering, preventing unnecessary suffering is critical, and I think aggregate demand is a tool we've got for that. In terms of spiralling to the bottom, can I say there's a paradox that's well recognised in the economic statistics now. We've got to be careful with that. Absolute levels of poverty are declining across the world. But within country inequality is increasing, between country inequality is decreasing. And it's one of the real ironies and paradoxes of our time that the Chinese have pulled literally tens of millions of people out of destitution through pretty brutal market reforms. So I don't think there is a race to the bottom. I think the dynamics are far more complex than that, and that's pretty consistent with the Marxist analysis that, you know, capitalism is a progressive force. You've just got to harness the good side of it and make sure you blunt the nasty side. But I'm happy to debate that out later if you like. In terms of guaranteed minimum income and guaranteeing everyone to increase their bargaining power, I am resolutely against that position. I think unless you make that a constitutional right that is absolutely enforceable, at the first time of a fiscal crisis, that will be one of the first things to be cut, and you'll just leave the workforce exposed without the protection of a strong minimum wage. Australia has built a labour market regime which has endured all sorts of assaults from employers and Conservative governments, and I think we trade that away at our considerable risk if we assume that something like a guaranteed minimum income is going to flourish. I think if you get a guaranteed minimum income written into the Constitution, that's called a revolution. So that's not going to happen for quite some time, so I would much rather rely on the award system and an effective minimum wage system than that kind of fiscal policy. As for Wynn's questions about has this been presented elsewhere, I can say yes, I have presented this to fairly senior parts of the Labor Party, and they are... Sure. I have talked about these issues with senior people in the Labor Party, and that presentation was actually prepared for senior people in the Labor Party. I have been talking pretty actively now since 1991 with unions and senior union officials on these kind of things, so I do work very hard to engage. And in terms of the bipartisan shift, I think, to cut a long story short, the Labor Party has never been a socialist party. The socialists have been a part of the Labor Party. but the Labor Party has usually reflected the prevailing form of liberalism. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, social liberalism or liberal collectivism was the ascendancy, and the Labor Party reflected that. The Labor Party didn't adopt a socialist program at the end of the Second World War. It adopted a liberal collectivist program from Keynes and Beveridge. It reflected that prevailing ethos of liberalism. The Labor Party is now reflecting the prevailing liberal ethos of liberalism, which is neoliberal free markets. What's particularly troubling about the Labor Party is its inability to grasp that, you know, the IMF, the World Bank and the OECD have recognised they went too far, and they're now trying to reposition themselves. That has not registered with the political class. You know, they're so enamoured with what the Australian says and what the Australian Financial Review says, they actually don't look at, you know, credible international economic agencies. But that to me is part of the history of liberalism, and I think if we're interested in progress, you've got to look beyond liberalism. Liberalism is important. You know, I think I would say I'm very supportive of liberal collectivism, but the dynamism is going to have to come from places like the Greens and that. And I think the Labor Party's not really capable of embracing the ideas without strong pressure from outside.
I don't have much to add other than what John said. Alan and I did present our paper about New Start to the ALP left in New South Wales last year sometime. I mean, just to add a little bit to John's comments about, you know, why is the Labor Party taking the direction it has? Obviously, the loss of confidence in Keynesian policies is a big factor. The story and narrative about globalisation is a big factor. But you can put all those things to one side for a moment. I think it's also the loss of, you know, creative energies, thinking, resources, etc., from the labour movement, and also from in the bureaucracy about building social democracy. So the intellectual heritage of social democracy, whether they call it liberal collectivism or where in the intellectual panorama you want to place it, also came from obviously thinkers in the labour movement and thinkers within the bureaucracy. And I think those sources are also severely diminished and impoverished to some extent. I mean, the Swedish model was built by the trade union movement through the political organ of the Social Democratic Party. And it's not surprising that when we think about social democracy today, it doesn't look anything like the kind of comprehensive, deep and programmatic agenda that was set out in the heyday of social democracy, particularly in some countries. So in that sense, I think you can see a desiccation, a falling away of alternative ideas for sure, but also power sources that are capable of generating, you know, the deep thinking required to build social democracy. Social democracy is an incredibly fussy, complicated, detailed, time-consuming, painstaking things to build. And the resources that go into that at all levels, intellectual, power, financial, you know, coalitions, etc., have all weakened. And so obviously the ideas and power resources that are driving Labor parties are coming from outside the Labor movement. So in a sense, I think it's a shift in the times and where coalitions, power and interests lie. It's affected ideas, thinking, but also confidence, which is a very crucial variable.
I don't want to be too fatalistic or too negative, but Thomas Piketty's basic argument that if you want to really do something about inequality is have a world war. I mean, if you look at his time series back to the French Revolution, the fundamental shifts in the distribution of income followed World War I and World War II. And he's got a pretty persuasive argument that it's pretty hard to have a democratic road to socialism. Now he is in the Party Socialist in France. He's kind of interested in democracy, but his argument is pretty compelling, and I say that, you know, begrudgingly. You know, I don't want to advocate that, but to shift the power of a ruling class is really hard, and to destroy a big chunk of its poverty through a world war really helps.
Clearly, the left is terrified of adopting a social democratic position because they think they won't win an election. But I think I do think we are reaching a point where the levels of inequality are becoming so intense, and the levels of marginality are becoming so intense. It may be there'll be a realization there has to be a different way, because it's not, neoliberalism clearly is no longer working.
If you see the South American experiment to some extent as a giant experiment in neoliberalism that happened a little bit before our time, I mean, I think democracies are capable of generating very powerful redistributionist forces outside the context of wars. The question is whether that will, materialise. So the South American redistribution, the redistributionist consequences of the rise of the new left in South America are very clear, and that happened outside the context of war and within more or less democratic frameworks. So in that sense, I want to say I'm slightly more optimistic. I'm assuming John meant that, made that comment in several different reasons. But if it's as simple as saying there's a giant natural experiment in neoliberalism in South America, and redistribution has left emerge, then one might hope that the consequences of what's the long process that's happening now will eventually produce a new coalition on the left. And you see what it takes to do that, of course. I mean, in Greece, it's obviously taken a complete smashing apart of an entire society in order to generate a left that's now still struggling to prevail against very powerful forces. An interesting and in some ways a process not for the faint-hearted. But I think we get an idea from what's gone on what it takes to generate a redistributionist leftist resurgence, and we probably haven't yet reached the kind of staggering inequalities and hardships that are likely to reduce it. There's maybe many things wrong with that position and articulation that I presented, but I mean I think that inequalities can be overcome within democratic frameworks. It takes a while. Of course, the other thing for sociologists is interesting is how we learn to just live with high inequality, and of course that takes us off into other areas, but it's a very significant question how inequalities become normalised and tolerated, and we see that at many levels already underway.
I was reading a book by a fairly moderate Keynesian by the name of Martin Ford, and he argues that given the prospect of permanent structural unemployment due to technological innovation, automation, there will be the necessity for a form of citizens' income which should be organised through a state-funded tax system designed to recuperate the productivity gains made in the last 30 years, distributed as funds to the permanently unemployed, people currently on New Start, so that in order to maintain levels of effective aggregate demand to maintain the functioning of the system, the existing system, from inevitable collapse. So what do you think of that proposition? And my second question is, do you think the system requires a permanent pool or reserve army of labour, the Lazarus layers of the working class, if you like, in order to maintain a low cost of labour and high profits?
Arthur Chesterfield Evans from the Greens. It seems to me that the game was set at Bretton Woods when the world was turned into a market to avoid wars, and it's been a monopoly game ever since, and that neoliberal leave it to the market has been internalised by governments. And then we've had three elements: the automation, the movement of the industry to the lowest worker price, the outsourcing you might call, and then the managerialism where every task is commodified and boxed to mean that as long as you follow the recipe, any mug can do it. So there's a lesser expertise in many jobs. And the point John made about education and health being where the jobs are is because they've just been a little bit slower to get automated and they can't be sent to China. Given this situation, with the government simply unwilling to take responsibility for that, it used to say God will fix it, now it says the market will fix it. At what point do we get new thinking in our governments to say, look, hang on, there is a problem here, it isn't working, which they seem extraordinarily unwilling to face.
Bruce Tongs' Progressive Labour Party, which is a socialist party, by the way, the capitalists say that full employment can exist with 2% of the workforce still unemployed. Well, to me that sounds like a contradiction in terms, which it is. And what do we do about socialism, which means full employment, means full employment, 100%. So, is there a chance of it sometime?
John, I agree completely with your objectives, but I was not convinced by your policy instruments. In particular, if you want to do something about unemployment. I can see that it's a complicated, difficult question if you want to lower what economists call the Nehru or Marxists call the reserve army of unemployment. That's a difficult question when you address that. But what's fairly straightforward is reducing cyclical unemployment. So the Reserve Bank of Australia at the moment, its estimate of the reserve army of unemployed is something like 5%. And its forecast for the unemployment rate are about 6.5%. That strikes me as a problem susceptible to a textbook mainstream economic solution, which is lowering interest rates. And I don't understand why you consider that a higher priority.
We had the first question about the prospects of technological unemployment means we should be looking at having some kind of guaranteed minimum income to keep demand up. I haven't read Ford's text. I would just simply say, you know, the microelectronics revolution that came out of the Second World War was absolutely phenomenal. We've had technological change before. It's how you handle that through all your instruments of policy. And I wouldn't give up on changing something around working hours. Frankly, I think we've got more prospects of getting a better policy and ensuring settlement around working time than we have around getting a guaranteed minimum income that will be secure. And I think getting a guaranteed minimum income in something like an Australian setting is a very long way away. But that's a judgment call, that's a political call, but I think the tax base that would be required to sustain that will be a lot harder to get mass support for than defending a strong minimum wage. But that's a political call. In terms of Arthur Chesterfield's comments about neoliberalism and the problems of automation, outsourcing and managerialism, I mean, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. Yes, there have been these trends across the world, but different countries have fared very differently. I mean, the Norwegians' unemployment rate's hardly drifted up above 4%. Everyone says they've got North Sea oil, well, we had the North-West Shelf. If you compare Iceland and Ireland's responses to the GFC, they all had problems of, you know, automation, outsourcing and managerialism, but Iceland's in a far healthier situation than Ireland because they basically pushed the crisis back onto capital. They didn't absorb, they didn't bail out the relevant finance sector and make the rest of the country pay for it. So I think there are more choices than is commonly recognised. Now, we had the question about is full employment still possible? And that's kind of Bruce Tom's question and Peter Shaw's question together. I've got no problem with using monetary policy, absolutely no problem at all. I just think it's a bit indiscriminate and I'd much rather have it targeted. I mean, I'm a bit nostalgic. I mean, I'm quite up to rationing certain forms of credit. So you just ration it to the housing market in Sydney. You know, there's X amount, put a cap on it. I know we don't control all the funds because there's a lot of money coming in from China, but that would take some to no doubt. I'd just be far more discriminating in how I use those instruments. So I'm sorry, I was hoping Bill Mitchell would be here, who's the macroeconomist. He's a lot stronger in that domain than myself. But monetary policy is certainly part of the armoury.
Look, I'm a sociologist, I'm not an economist, but I think the crucial thing is that we really need to keep the concept of a decent society in the forefront of our minds, and that's what we should aspire to. And I think that a whole notion of what is a decent society, what do we want, is really being lost. You know, the market is so dominant, and I think this is what really needs to be fought. This notion that the market can resolve all our problems. And I think we also have lost the notion of what constitutes a decent society. And maybe, Sen's notion of capabilities, I think, is a good start. To give everybody the capacity to live a decent life. I think that's what we should aspire to.
I guess I'd just reflect on a couple of points there. The basic income or guaranteed minimum income schemes have obviously that idea's been around for a long time. I think other than really what John said about political feasibility and other questions about it, I think is it built on a kind of pessimism, a kind of technological pessimism that somehow the sphere of politics or political power has got nothing to do with the current unemployment problems. So, as John was saying, if you look around at how unemployment is managed within the institutions of government and political coalitions, countries facing very similar kinds of problems can produce very, very different outcomes. So I think the problem with the kind of let's give up on work, just move over to a basic income or a guaranteed minimum income doesn't really address that fundamental problem of political institutions and power very well. But the other thing I'd say about that is that I think it also gives up on the fact that most people want a job. They like working. It's enjoyable. You make friends, you learn skills, you solve problems, and that goes for all kinds of work that some people are contemptuous about. The other thing I'd say is that, I don't know if this is still true, but I remember Esping Andersen is a kind of quite famous Danish-American sociologist who looked at work and how to try and resolve problems of unemployment, was that the problem was largely not one of the generation of new jobs. That still happens. I don't know the last 10 years since that book came out, whether that's that argument or that those facts are still in place. But it's mainly that the labour market now has to do so much more than it ever did. It's got to cope with older people. It's got to cope with the expectations of people with disabilities who rightfully want to work. It's got to cope with as he called it, the incomplete revolution, where women should be and are entitled to complete equality as far as access to work goes. So the question is, if everybody has an expectation of working for lots of their lives, how does the state deal with that? And I think it's not just a question of technology and whether work can be created. It's the political project through which, however it's managed through time, hours, access, that we realise that people fulfil themselves, even in boring jobs, in remarkably important ways. And the goal, therefore, I think, is to try to shift the political coalition away from the market dominating how work is distributed in the economy and the amount of it, back towards a coalition that promotes equality of access to work and distributes it properly. And I think that can be done without having to turn in the direction of what I think is a pessimistic kind of solution, that we can't really solve the problems of work. We have to deny people's claims for meaningful work, and we'll just somehow patch it up by taxing somehow part of capital or the working population distributed to people who don't work. The people who end up on a decent minimum income, let's imagine that happen, will still probably be people at the bottom end of the class distribution, and their needs for meaningful work, for participation, all kinds, are probably going to be denied under those circumstances as well. So I don't think we can avoid the challenge of full employment. I think that goes on.
Martin Ford actually argues that people will be paid a basic minimum income on condition that they engage in socially meaningful activities, creative activities of benefit to the common weal. So that's his argument. That you have that basic minimum.
Yeah, which you can do you can do that through the public sector, for instance, which has been
expand the public sector.
Okay, but that's different from a kind of, that means you get the basic income through guaranteeing full employment, rather than saying, well, let's leave work to the market and we'll kind of just treat the people who are marginalised a bit better, which is the kind. Right.
I want to thank you all for wonderful presentations, particularly John Buchanan. Thinking about what I might say, I'm just a moment ago reminded of Spain in the 1930s, prior to the Republican Revolution. 3 groups were overcome to the, unfortunately, in the end. They were incredibly wealthy. The army, who had more generals per privates than any other army in Europe, and the church. Just contemplate that for a moment in relation to Australia at the moment. I think that John's comments about the failure of the ALP to understand what is going on outside Australia are absolutely right. We have in the United States Hillary Clinton now campaigning against inequality. What on earth has stopped the ALP from getting stuck into those bunch of secondary school dropouts who run the government when they bang on about these people need to get into work? Where are the jobs? My principal questions are two. Yes, all right. Two questions. A simple one is, how on earth do we have these hire companies from Taiwan and the rest engaging people I won't. How do we have these hire companies operating in this country? The bigger question is a set of papers, research papers, in the last 3 or so years have demonstrated conclusively that companies are using the distribution of, I'm going to lose this, the distribution of their dividends, capitals, whatever, share buybacks and so on and so forth, in order to increase their cash so as to pay it out as dividends to the shareholders. And the consequence is a lack of involvement in R&D, development, modernisation, employment and everything else.
Hi, thanks very much for your talks. You may have read David Grader's popular article on bullshit jobs, and this is a very interesting article, but he quite conspicuously tiptoed around the question of jobs that actually do more harm than good. And I think there's a real problem in this, and if you're not particularly mainstream economists, you might say there are issues about economics itself. So Stephen Keen has his book Debunking Economics, where he refers to the Sonnenschein-Mantel-de Broglie theorem, failure of general equilibrium. It's been known since the 70s, or this fundamental equation about maximising profit for a firm by tweaking the output quantity, which if you show the mathematics to any hard scientist or engineer, they'll say, yes, this is rubbish. But you can look also at social work, which showed itself to do more harm than good in the 70s, and this is from Joel Fisher, the sort of founding father of the evidence-based social work movement. Psychiatry has many issues today with the drug-based approach, which is demonstrably wrong in many cases and amounts to a form of eugenics. Even medicine, the health economist Jeff Richardson showed there's a long history of discussing medicine as potentially doing more harm than good. The work of the prestigious epidemiologist Charlie Cochrane going back to 1978, and our local Jeff Richardson says it's still an issue. So we face a future where possibly a growing portion of the economy is employed, and I put it to you that a lot of these people, not all of them, but a lot of them are employed to actually justify inequality. There's a middle class professional jobs whose role it is simply to justify why there should be a professional middle class as distinct from the poor. And this is a really circular kind of economic situation, and it ties in with workers' identity. So could you please address, is it possible for economics to account for the concept of bullshit jobs, potentially driven by an education system that is meting out degrees simply to justify great pay inequality that is not really accountable in any kind of evidence-based way in many cases?
Good one.
I just first of all follow up on what our colleague said to my colleagues on my right mentioned the need for elevating decency as a value. And this kind of goes to the need to put up a concern with inequality up there. I want to be quite controversial at this point and say Miliband tried that in the last UK election and got smashed to smithereens. And anyone who knows my politics knows I despise Blairism and the third way. But we've got to be really smart in the way in which we think about, we take up these issues. Now, Thomas Frank is one of my favourite social writers. He's written a book called One Market Under God, The Wrecking Crew and Pity the Billionaire. His argument is pretty simple, that the history of political populism from the late 19th century through to the 1960s was when the market went into crisis. In democracies, people looked to the state to help solve the problem. So in the downturn of the 1890s, you had the rise of socialist and Labour and social democratic parties. In the crisis of the 30s, you had the rise of the far left, the Communist Party, Southern Communist parties. Capital and allied forces were determined to ensure that the next time the crisis came along, the state would be defined as part of the problem and as not part of the solution. So we're actually living in an era of market populism, and the left still has not come to grips with it. That is deeply embedded in the culture. And so when we're framing political calculation, we've got to think about how do you work with that legacy. Miliband said Piketty's the bestseller, you know, the World Bank's saying all the right stuff, we can run hard on inequality. That is a totally non-materialist analysis, one I was very sympathetic with, but you've got a population now, and you saw this from our other presenters, you know, people have only known John Howard, you know, that's something that the left has failed to come to grips with, and that's why I was throwing ideas out there and saying, you don't go back, you know, what worked in the past won't work now. That's why I'm saying you've got to look at new ways of managing risk. You've got to look at things like ethical labour hire, you've got to look at ethical group training companies. You've got to look at what it means to nurture mobility in the labour market. And these are different ways of thinking about social rights. And that's what the left's always done. The left has flourished when it's figured out new ways of using concepts of solidarity to confront the immediate situation. It doesn't stick to the same old methods. It's flourished where it's used the principle of solidarity in a new situation. And so, for me, we had this thing about the bullshit jobs argument and some jobs doing more harm than good. I think there is something to this. You know, a quality job is not necessarily what we've thought about, and that's why the research I've been working on for the last 5 years has been actually thinking about what are the vocations, what are the ways in which we define what occupational identity is. And it isn't necessarily about turning the health system into something that's colonised purely by doctors and purely by nurses. We think about what's health work. You know, when we go to care, we don't think necessarily about disability care and aged care, we think about what's care. This is the debate we've got to have, because we've got to look at the content of work in a more expansive way than we have today. And I know that's probably where the far leftist thing is coming through. That is an over the horizon idea. But unless we start to think of new ways of defining the contours of solidarity, what are the ways in which people define common interest that's different to the past, but engages with those issues of risk, engages with those issues of solidarity in a new way. I think it's when we start to do that, we start to get into an exciting space where you can start to put up exciting ideas that will resonate, because they can't be written off as yesterday's ideas, and they engage with their current challenges.
I think another crucial aspect is to break this notion of agency, that individuals can determine their futures and that they have total control. And I think the left really needs to elevate the whole issue of structure. You know, starting with issues like schooling, for example. I mean, it's incredible how unequal schooling is. It's a fundamental. And how can we possibly talk about social justice when we have such a totally a system where people are starting at such different places, right from the early stage of their life. So I think these are issues which the left could really work on and create and mobilise around. But it is difficult.
Yeah, just reflecting a little on what John said. I can't remember who said it, but it's often said, someone said it, that the great advantage of social democracy over other leftist ideologies was its flexibility, and it could respond to the times. I guess we've also had a lesson on the downside, incredible hyper-flexibility on the left, where, I think that's a theme that's run through tonight, that things have just been junked because, that it could be done. So it's one of the difficult problems of social democratic programs. Their strength is their flexibility, their weakness is their flexibility when that flexibility is influenced by power shifts outside it. To address your question about the kind of ideological content of jobs and so on, is that more or less what... It reminds me a little bit of the debate that happened in that generation of Frankfurt School scholars, whether technology was bad or whether it was the uses of the technology that were bad, not the technology itself. And I, wax and wane in my own thinking about that. But I think in this case that you'd have to, I don't think I can fully agree with that proposition that Graeber puts. I think it's dismissing the importance of a whole range of jobs that we need, from social work through to medicine, whatever, and saying that just because we've got it wrong either in the past or there's a prevailing ideology in the way this is done, that the jobs themselves are kind of either ideological or useless and could be replaced. And you just think of psychiatry or nursing. I mean, what would you replace it with? Witch doctors or family members? I mean, you get into very, very tricky territory when you start to think how that might be decentralised radically and what consequences might emerge, especially where that kind of leads to, a kind of excessively postmodern critique of all kinds of power, where, everything from telling somebody what to do about, in a nursing context about how to look after kids or something suddenly becomes a kind of domination and so on. So I do think it's a question of how politics and ideology play out within jobs, rather than the question of whether jobs can be dispensed with and therefore should be seen purely through the prism of ideology. So I guess I take a more reformist line on it.
Well, can everybody put their hands together and thank the speakers? Thank you.